Welcome, everyone, to HEI's live stream, where we speak with experts from around the world on topics related to air pollution and health. Today, I'm really excited that we have two guests joining us to talk about air pollution in cities, where we are right now, and how cities are trying to improve air quality and public health. I would like to welcome Dr. Susan Annenberg, who is an associate professor at George Washington University. She's joining us today from Washington, D.C., in the US. And also Mr. Bhushan, who's joining us from Kathmandu, Nepal, and is the chief of party at FHI 360 and has over 30 years of experience working on urban issues in Nepal. Welcome both. Really excited to have you here. And Susan, if we can start off with you, we just published this, big report together looking at air quality data and health impacts in cities around the world, um, trying to see where we're making progress and where we may be lagging. But why should we be thinking so deeply about air pollution in cities? And based on the data that we have so far, what is the outlook for cities that are rapidly urbanizing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, Pallavi. Great to see you and looking forward to this conversation with you, Bhushan, as well. Urban air pollution is really, really important, and we have very little information around the world about how air pollution levels look in urban areas. And when you think about the fact that half the world's population lives in urban areas, that's expected to grow to about two-thirds of the population within the next couple decades. Cities are also experiencing dramatic health inequities, public health impacts, and inequitable distributions of pollution within their borders. And cities are responsible for about three-quarters of greenhouse gas emissions globally. A lot of this traces back to the same source, which is fossil fuel combustion. And if we can understand air pollution levels in urban areas, we can see it, we can monitor, we can track it, we can actually start to do something about it. And of course, cities around the world are already working on this problem, tackling the problem. But the more we can visualize how pollution is changing as a result of emissions increases, fossil fuel combustion increases for transportation, for industry, for power generation, and then possibly the flip side decreases as a result of policies and actions that are being taken to reduce emissions. The more we can track that pollution, the more we can inform city governments as well as national governments about how to mitigate the problem and improve public health.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have an image from the report which shows, different cities and what the air pollution levels are. So if we can pull that up for a minute, looking at PM 2.5 levels, I think lots of hotspots around the world, including South Asia, which has been in the news for several years now. We continue to hear how cities in South Asian countries have very high levels of air pollution. And Push, turning to you, I'm wondering if you can comment based on your experience a little bit on what has been changing in cities in South Asia, especially in Kathmandu, where you've lived for a long time, and how are cities beginning to think about these, rapidly increasing emissions, what to do about those?
Well, as Susan just said, the urbanization is happening very rapidly. We're already more than 50% urban, and by 2050, which is just around the corner, we're going to be two-thirds urban. And if you look at where this urbanization is happening, it's happening mostly in developing countries. More than 90% of that urban growth is happening in developing countries, in poor communities within developing countries. And in that figure you showed as well, what we see is this air pollution hotspots, mainly centered around South Asia and Western Africa and some of the other developing regions around the world. So what's happening is, on one side, we're seeing very rapid urbanization happening and city governments struggling to deal with this on urban management. There are a lot of priority issues: garbage, infrastructure, transportation, and so on. So air pollution is not really the first thing that comes to mind for city government officials. But thanks to some of the work you're doing and people like you are doing, constant advocacy, and what we are feeling in these cities, this people are starting to feel the pains of air pollution, the health impacts. Now, slowly, cities are starting to wake up. And I think cities are starting to be more aware of this problem, starting to prepare plans, starting to, do some action. Not enough, but that has started. I think we need to put that advocacy pressure on so that we can have more awareness and more action. But what we see is already something happening. Look at Kathmandu, for example. It has an air quality management plan now. But what we need to do is, ensure that that plan is implemented, ensure that the government has resources to implement that plan, and to ensure that the government works with all stakeholders to do so. We see that in Delhi as well. Big cities like Delhi, Delhi government just came up with this 15-point action plan for this winter. Okay. Yes, there are problems with that plan, but still there is something there. And I think what is missing now is, even in that map that you showed, a lot of the big cities is where the highlight is. I think that some of the smaller cities is where we're missing. And that's where we lack data, that's where we lack action, and that's where we need to focus on as we move on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually want to just quickly show those that are listening in how the NO2 levels have changed in Kathmandu over the last 10 or so years. So if we can pull up the figure, it just shows these are nitrogen dioxide levels in Kathmandu city in the last 10 or 11 years, as you see a very steady increase. And as we start thinking about health, how this impacts people's health. I mean, I've been to Kathmandu a few times. I know, Bhushan, you live there. So there's very, clear ways in which we can experience the high levels of air pollution, not being able to, breathe as easily sometimes if you're in the middle of the traffic. But as you pointed out, not having sufficient spotlight on smaller cities and towns, I think that is a big problem. And Susan, I want to turn to you. And, we always hear like we don't have sufficient air quality monitoring data. I think we have a map here from OpenAQ, which shows some of, monitoring stations around the world. So we see lots of dots here from North America, lots of dots in Europe, but as we start to move in some other parts of the world, not as many monitoring stations. So, how are scientists trying to overcome this barrier to provide information, not just for the big cities or where the data exists from ground monitoring, but also in other parts of the world?
There's a really exciting array of new technologies that people are using, but I want to go back to that map for a second because it does look like we have a lot of monitors very densely located in places of the world where we do have a lot of monitors in the US and Europe. But even so, these icons are, covering the fact that we actually don't have a lot of coverage even in these regions, the United States and in Europe. So the city that I live in, Washington, D.C., we have 4 PM2.5 monitors for a million people about for the city of Washington, D.C. And that's the good situation in the U.S., which is has relatively more monitors compared with the rest of the world. So we need some other data sources. We need to bring in other data sources to fill in these gaps between the monitors where we have monitors, and even just provide first estimates in places of the world where we don't have any ground monitors. And some of the technologies that people are using are satellite remote sensing. So we actually have a fleet of satellites that are constantly circumnavigating the world and taking snapshots of the composition of the Earth's air. Really incredible when you think about it, that we have this technology, these satellites that are just flying out there in space and taking snapshots of pollution levels that we're breathing here on Earth. And those can tell us quite a bit about how pollution varies all around the world. We also have a rapidly proliferating market of so-called low-cost sensors. These are monitors that are taking measurements of pollution at the ground, but they're much cheaper. They're much less costly than the federal reference monitors that are typically used for regulatory purposes in countries. And then we have an exciting array of sort of up-and-coming technologies. People are actually outfitting vehicles with mobile monitoring, so mounting sensors onto vehicles and then driving them around street by street. That's giving us a great sense for how traffic-related air pollution varies within cities. And I think our next step is really to figure out how to integrate multiple data sources, because each of these has their own strengths and weaknesses. And I think we have a lot of opportunities to learn from multiple sources simultaneously.
I think some of these are very exciting developments, and hopefully we'll continue to add to the different ways in which we can get data. Bhushan, I'm wondering. I know low-cost sensors have also been used in the South Asian context and in Kathmandu. So, what are some of your reflections on how these types of new technologies and new ways of collecting data are helping us or could potentially help us going forward?
Definitely. I'm really looking forward to it. In fact, right now we're putting up 30 low-cost sensors all around Kathmandu Valley. There are 18 municipalities, and what we're doing is at least one or two sensors in each municipality. Right. So in a big municipality like Kathmandu, we'll have 7 or 8 monitors, and throughout Nepal there's going to be 71 monitors. This is a project we're doing together with Duke University in the US and Tribhuvan University in Nepal. Now, what this will give us is it'll give us data, right? Additional data that we can use. But more importantly, what it does is it democratizes the data collection process, right? So now each municipality can have their own data. That ownership is going to be there. So hopefully they will take that data and then start to use that data in their planning processes, get that data into action. And then the third thing that's going to happen is citizens are going to have data accessible in their mobile phones, through an app or so. So then we're going to have citizen science initiatives where citizens are using that data, just like Susan said about, even mobile data is going to be available. So it's not just about numbers. It's about taking that numbers, owning it, and then putting it into action. And that is possible through these, wide network of sensors. Before we used to have just monitoring stations, which cost quite a bit, $100,000 or so, and then there are a few, but that's not enough, right? So we need to have data that everybody can have access to, everybody can feel that this is my data, and everybody that can use it. And this low-cost sensors, I think, would be really helpful, and we're looking forward to this. We already have a few that's operational, but we'll have a much wider network in the near future.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think, just even looking back at my own experience, I've been working on air pollution for such a long time, but to convince my mother that cooking in a kitchen with LPG, this is not with, coal or wood or anything, is still really harmful. I had to install a, portable monitor in the kitchen, let her cook. I got to enjoy really good food at the end of it, and she was able to see just, how pollution levels just like kept PM 2.5 levels actually kept rising up as she was, making parathas for me. So I think the power that some of these new technologies are giving us is just really immense, and hopefully we can all continue working together to use these data now to apply the findings from these to actual solutions. And yes,
I just wanted
Bhushan.
to add to that. And the other thing is, I remember, I have one of these sensors at home, and we had this citizen level campaign going 5 years ago when there was no monitoring stations in Kathmandu. There were 18 monitoring, low cost sensors that we, as just a citizen group, we were operating. It was called Drishti. But then I used to take this, little sensor whenever I go out, and then my young son, he used to look at that data, and he used to see, well, if we have a barbecue, we went to Pokhara and we had a barbecue and could see how it just jumps up. So he was getting all excited about it. So I think it's good to get people excited about, somewhat boring, otherwise boring numbers. I know Susan would not agree with that, but I'd say this is good for education purposes. It's good to get children, it's good to get everyone from children to your mother to your grandmother excited about air quality.
Yeah, Susan, if I can actually come back to you for a quick second, in the US context, low-cost sensors have been used extensively in the last few years, both for science and for, community efforts for education and schools and colleges. And, are there ways that these low-cost sensors are also helping us uncover some of these inequities that you mentioned, starting from the US, perhaps, where we have a lot of them in use already?
Yes, absolutely. And it is amazing that we have so many sensors now in multiple cities across the United States, and they're helping us to track neighborhood scale air pollution. We know that air pollution is inequitably distributed within US cities, with communities of color and those with lower income and educational attainment levels experiencing higher levels of pollution. And we don't have a way to monitor those using the EPA networks, given that they are very, very sparsely located. So these low-cost sensors, if you put them all across cities, you can actually monitor neighborhood scale pollution. They, of course, have some challenges, these sensors, with calibration and drift, but they're quite useful in being able to show these spatial patterns of pollution, how they vary at the neighborhood scale. And we can actually make decisions based on information like that to say, our cities are undergoing transformative action. So electrification of municipal bus fleets, for example, and can actually make informed decisions about where to put those electric bus routes based on the inequitable distribution of pollution. So you can very easily see how these low cost sensors can go from collecting data to informing decisions to improving public health.
Great. I think this issue of sort of using the data to make decisions is going to be very critical going forward. And in our last live stream, we had Dr. Zorana Anderson on, who was talking about the fact that air pollution and climate are really closely linked together. You also mentioned that earlier, Susan. And thinking about electrification, Bhushan, I have to ask you, since you've been involved in Sajak and a lot of other transport-related initiatives in Nepal. How are cities in general, and especially in Kathmandu, how is the city thinking about the use of electric vehicles or other types of measures that will help us address both air pollution and climate? And I think in the context of that, what types of data, what types of tools are useful for people in making these decisions?
Um, Thanks, Pallavi. Frankly speaking, I don't think cities are too much concerned about climate, at least cities in our part of the world right now, because it's too far away from them. It's too intangible. There are a lot of pressing problems that city governments are facing. And also, a lot of times, cities in the developing world or people in the developing world in general tend to feel like that's not our problem. Who is responsible for climate change? A lot of the emissions coming from developed countries. Well, they should fix it. And sometimes, if you just use the climate argument, it could even backfire. Why should I do it? Let the US do it or so on. But then air pollution is closer to home. Air pollution is about us. It's about our children. It's about our health. And therefore, I think when you use air pollution as the indicator, this is what we want. You get climate co-benefit as well. In Kathmandu, for example, the main four sources of air pollution, it's one, vehicles, right? So when we talk about electrification of the vehicle fleet, particularly public vehicles, of course, it reduces air pollution and it has climate benefit as well, particularly in a country like ours where all our electricity is hydro, it's clean electricity. So that is a big win-win. Second, we know that a big chunk of the greenhouse gases or climate pollutant is methane. We also know that waste burning is a major problem. So waste management, when we propose good waste management, it's good for climate, it's good for air pollution. The third source of pollution is household energy. Again, a country like Nepal, where 67% of the people still cook with biomass, solid biomass. This is very important. This will also lead to climate benefits. Yeah. So, and the fourth one is industry, like brick kilns. Again, they use coal. If you reduce, energy, coal consumption over there, it'll benefit both. And I think to use those arguments, it's really helpful. It's a win-win for both air pollution and climate. And in that context, if you use the health data that people like Susan and you are working on, it's really helpful to drive home that message and convince people that this is something that we need to work on. Going back to your electric vehicle issue, I think this is something that everybody is excited about right now. I mean, right now, I work with Sajak and 37 buses are on their way. They're in Tibet, somewhere in Tibet right now. They're heading to Kathmandu, and we're all excited to get them rolling on the streets of Nepal. Government of Nepal invested $25 million in Sajak for electric vehicles. So government is now starting to come up. Of course, we've seen much bigger investment in India on electric buses. And if you look at the data on sales of electric buses last year, 2021, 44% of the total number of buses that were sold were actually electric. That's huge. So this is going big time, and people are realizing that this is a win-win. And it's also good for overall public transport improvement because it's a lot comfort, it's more comfortable, and so on. And speaking of that mobile data that sensors. One thing we hope to do once we get our 37 buses, we already have 3 on the roads, by the way, but 40, our full fleet of 40 comes. We hope to do some sampling in our diesel bus versus our electric bus and show that even inside the bus there's a big difference. I'm sure there is. So yes, it's something that's exciting, that's happening in many cities around the world, this whole electrification of transport. That is certainly a low-hanging fruit that we can take both for climate and air pollution control.
Thank you, Bhushan. I know I'm very familiar with, Sajak and what it has been doing, but for those of us joining from around the world, could you tell us in very few words what Sajak is, what it has been doing, and what it is looking forward to in coming years?
Well, just it's a public transport company. We've been around for the past 60 years or so. It's an old public transport company that went down because of government intervention. Then a group of citizens got together and brought it back to life. This is about 8 years ago. And from day one, we've said that we want to be environment friendly. So when the government the standard was Euro 1 vehicles, we went to Euro 3 vehicles, then we went to Euro 4. Now we've said that we're only going to add electric vehicles, no more diesel vehicles in our fleet. We have 71 diesel vehicles that is slowly being phased out. So right now, 40 electric buses coming, and we're also doing an experiment with trying to convert our diesel buses to electric. So we're doing that as well. So hopefully, in the next 5 years or so, we can convert all our fleet to electric and provide good environment-friendly public transportation in Kathmandu and beyond. So that's what we do. And also the other thing we do is the whole institutionalization of public transport systems. Public transport should have investment from the government. What we're seeing in Kathmandu is really the private sector investing in public transport and the government not doing anything. That doesn't work. Yes, private sector can do things efficiently, but we need government investment. And that's what we're working on. That's where we got that $25 million worth of investment from the government of Nepal, also some investment from the city governments. So it's the first time city governments are investing in public transport. So that ownership is absolutely necessary. And public transport, we feel, should be the backbone of any transport systems in any city. And that should be green.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And I think, looking at some of the data that this report we produced last month, and also many other analysis that people have been doing, show the very high, health impact. So it is important that efforts like these continue in different places. I think we have an image, just to stay focused on Kathmandu for a minute, we have an image of how the burden of PM 2.5 exposures in Kathmandu and the health impacts has changed over the last many years. So if we can pull up that graphic just to show people that in many places, these exposures have very real, tangible effects on people's health. This number, almost 5,000 deaths in the city in just 1 year linked to PM 2.5 exposure. That's a pretty big number. And I know we are all now gearing up for the COP meetings that are going to be held next month in Egypt. And for those of you who may not be very familiar, COP meetings have been held annually. They're a place for governments, other institutions to come together and talk about how we are addressing climate change. In one of the COP meetings, the Paris Agreement was also formulated. So a period of a lot of conversation, coming out of new ideas, trying to push governments in certain directions to address the issues related to climate change. And I'm going to turn to you first, Susan, as we look to COP and we see all these interconnections between air pollution and climate and health. What are you hoping comes out of these discussions, and what are the ways in which air pollution can be, perhaps a central argument for climate action in certain parts of the world?
I think Bhushan said it well. If we reduce fossil fuel combustion, we will not only get the climate benefits, slow climate change, but we will also get these other societal benefits that are very real and tangible, including reduced air pollution, improved air quality, but also a lot of other benefits that just sort of depend on the measures that are taken to reduce emissions. So, increased physical activity, and improved mental health from active transportation and from use of public transportation, from expanding green space, improved mortality outcomes, as well as improved mental health. Even green jobs and economic benefits are coming from this transition to a low carbon, zero carbon economy. So there's a lot of other benefits that come along with reducing fossil fuel combustion in addition to mitigating climate change. And a lot of those are happening local and immediately where the measures are being implemented to reduce emissions. And that's why it's so important for cities to understand the air pollution impacts, because those benefits in terms of reduced air pollution would happen locally and immediately where the city is to the local population, as opposed to the impacts on climate change of a city taking action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those would happen, those are globally diffuse. They happen over a period of decades. Those air pollution benefits, the improvements in air quality and the public health improvements that come along with that happen locally and immediately to the local population.
Thank you. I think, really good points. And turning to you, Bhushan, in South Asia, air pollution is definitely a like high priority issue. We are going into a season that we all, are going to see lots of headlines on air pollution. Pakistan just had deadly floods, which have impacted millions and millions. So as you think about this intersection of air pollution and health and climate, what are you hoping that cities in, South Asia, like our part of the world, what should we be focusing on, and where do we need more data, where do we need more science, and where can we make tangible progress to improve both air quality, improve people's health?
Thank you. Looking forward to COP, as you mentioned earlier. I think two things that we need to focus on. One is to drive home the state of emergency. It's really a climate crisis. You mentioned Pakistan, over 1,000 people killed. Even in US, we just saw Ian, just cause all this damage in Florida. Now, people can argue whether that's due to climate or not, but still, we know that these events are happening all over the globe. And it's really a climate crisis. We're not talking about climate change anymore. So that, recognizing that urgency in spite of everything else that's happening globally. We know, what's happening in Ukraine. We know what's happening with the pandemic and so on. But still, climate crisis is important. This is something that has to be driven home to everybody there. Second, if you want to do something about it, the low-hanging fruits are probably in our part of the world, right? We have to take care of our garbage anyway. We have to take care of the pollution from our diesel vehicles anyway. We have to take care of our, brick kilns and other industrial pollution anyway. We have to take care of the household energy that's killing, thousands every year. So these are the low-hanging fruits and the win-win, solutions. And this is where we need to invest in. This is where we need to go forward with a social campaign like there is no tomorrow. This is something that we need to start now. And this is something that governments, particularly from our parts of the world, need to understand, particularly as we go into the winter season now. We are going to see very high levels of pollution in the next 2-3 months. Definitely, we're already seeing that happening in Delhi a little bit, with the crop burning already started. And normally, once pollution level goes up in Delhi, around 3 weeks later, we get that as well. So it's very predictable now. We have some of that data. Yes, more data could be useful. We also have good now data coming from the kind of analysis you guys are doing, like that data about the health impact. 5,000 people losing their lives every year is big in one city, right? Just before coming here, actually, I was watching this documentary on Netflix called Aftershock that was just released on the Nepal earthquake that happened in 2015. That was a big event that, about 9,000 people lost their lives. But this is 5,000 in one city, 1 year. And if you look at the data going up, what you see is that in the last 10 years, that number has almost tripled. So we have to do something like that. So something about it. And I think we need to use those numbers, that data, to drive this message home and tell people, tell policymakers, tell private sector as well, that this is really an urgent issue. This is a public health crisis, not just an environmental crisis. And I think this is something that we can drive home in COP, as well as pre and post COP every day. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this, really powerful message that this is all coming back to people's health. And, that's where our focus needs to be. And also some hopeful messages, I think, from what both of you shared. We have ways to collect more data. We have ways to democratize data and make it more meaningful for people so that they see what these numbers really mean. And I really hope that, we can continue to use these data to find ways to make bring policy that is meaningful, to bring some behavior change which might be needed to address some of the issues, and most importantly, I think finding ways to work together, because we're going to need all kinds of people in this conversation, not just the scientists, not just the policymakers. We need really everybody. So I think, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today for this excellent conversation. I wish we had another hour because I have so many more questions for you. But hopefully we can, come back with some of those in the future. And for those of you listening in, thanks a lot for joining us. A video will be available shortly on our website, on our social media. And we welcome you to join us next month in November, again on the 7th of the month, where we will talk specifically about air pollution, health, and climate in the African continent, just as COP gets started. Thank you very much once again, and hope to see you soon.